There are cases which Holmes solved with such brilliance that I have felt compelled to record them almost immediately, the details still vivid, the admiration still fresh upon my mind. And there are others, quieter, stranger, heavier in their way, that I have carried with me for years before setting pen to paper, not because I had forgotten them, but because I was not yet certain I understood what I had witnessed. The matter of Houndsworth belongs to this latter category. I have turned it over in my mind on many evenings since, sitting alone by the fire long after Holmes had retired to his room or vanished into one of his peculiar chemical experiments, and each time I arrive at the same uneasy conclusion, that we solved the case, yes, and that the solution was correct in every particular, and that none of it brought anyone the peace they were owed. It was a grey morning in the February of 1895 when the affair first presented itself to us, carried into our sitting room at Baker Street, not by a client in person, but by a letter. 2 letters, in fact, arriving by the same post but written in very different hands. Holmes had been in one of his restless moods for several days, pacing between the window and the mantelpiece, plucking absently at his violin without producing anything resembling a melody, and I had learned from long experience that such moods ended either in the cocaine bottle or in a case. I was therefore grateful when Mrs. Hudson brought up the morning's correspondence, and Holmes seized upon it with the quick, sharp attention of a hawk sighting movement in the grass below. The first letter was from a Dr. Edwin Ferrars, the superintendent of an institution called Houndsworth House, located some 40 miles west of London in the rolling, rather bleak countryside near the Surrey-Hampshire border. It was a private asylum, or, as Dr. Ferrars preferred to term it in his letter, a house of restoration for those afflicted in mind and spirit. He wrote in a careful, educated hand, and his tone was that of a man who had deliberated for some time before writing and wished to convey that deliberation in every sentence. He described a situation which he found troubling, but which he could not, he confessed, articulate with the precision he would have liked. A patient had died. The death had been recorded as a natural failure of the heart, and the attending physician, Dr. Ferrars himself, had signed the certificate. But in the weeks since, certain small observations had accumulated in his mind, none of them conclusive, all of them disquieting, and he had begun to wonder whether he had been too hasty in his determination. He did not accuse anyone. He did not suggest foul play in explicit terms. He simply asked whether Mr. Holmes might be willing to visit Houndsworth and cast his eye over the circumstances so that Dr. Ferrars might either confirm his original conclusion or confront whatever truth lay beneath it. The second letter was from a woman named Mrs. Alice Beckford, and it was written in a hand that trembled visibly across the page. She identified herself as the sister of the deceased patient, a man called Lionel Marsh, aged 41, who had been a resident of Houndsworth House for nearly 3 years before his death 6 weeks prior. Mrs. Beckford's letter was shorter and far more direct than Dr. Ferrars. She believed her brother had been murdered. She believed the institution was concealing something, and she begged Mr. Holmes, in terms that were almost painful in their desperation, to investigate before whatever evidence remained was lost entirely. Holmes read both letters twice, then handed them to me without comment. I read them through and looked up to find him already standing by the window, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that familiar posture of intense concentration. 2 letters concerning the same death, I said, arriving on the same morning, from 2 people who almost certainly did not coordinate their appeals. That alone is suggestive. It is more than suggestive, Watson. It is the most interesting thing about this affair so far. When 2 people independently feel compelled to seek outside help regarding a death that has already been officially explained, it tells us that the official explanation has failed to satisfy not only the bereaved, who might be expected to struggle with acceptance, but also the authority who provided it. Dr. Ferrars signed the death certificate himself. He is now writing to me because he does not trust his own signature. That is a man whose conscience is troubling him. And I find troubled consciences to be among the most reliable indicators that something has gone wrong. We took the 10:40 from Waterloo that same morning. The journey carried us through increasingly sparse and rolling country, the fields brown and dormant under a low sky that seemed to press down upon the earth with a kind of patient, implacable weight. Holmes sat in silence for much of the journey, his eyes fixed on the passing landscape, but seeing, I suspected, nothing of it. His mind was already at work, building and discarding frameworks, testing possibilities against the scant information we possessed. I had long since learned not to interrupt these silences. They were as essential to his process as the visible moments of deduction that so impressed our clients. We were met at the small station of Bramdean by a trap sent from Houndsworth, driven by a taciturn man in a heavy coat who spoke only to confirm our names and the road ahead. The drive took us along narrow lanes bordered by hedgerows still bare from winter, and after perhaps 20 minutes we crested a gentle rise and saw Houndsworth House for the first time. It was not what I had expected. I had imagined something grim and institutional, perhaps a converted workhouse or a building of that deliberately forbidding character which so many asylums seem to cultivate, as though the architecture itself were meant to discipline the mind. Houndsworth was nothing of the sort. It was a large country house, clearly of the previous century, built in warm red brick with generous windows and a handsome portico. Smoke rose from several chimneys. The grounds were well maintained, with gravel paths winding through what would be, in summer, attractive gardens. It looked, in short, like a place where a prosperous family might live in comfort, and this appearance of domestic normality struck me as both deliberate and, in a way I could not quite define, unsettling. One expects suffering to announce itself. When it is housed in beauty, the mind resists it. Dr. Ferrars met us in the entrance hall, a broad, well-lit space with a polished floor and a faint smell of carbolic beneath the more pleasant scent of wood smoke. He was a man of about 50, lean and upright, with thinning hair and spectacles that he had a habit of removing and polishing when he was thinking. His manner was courteous but strained, the manner of a man who is accustomed to authority and finds it uncomfortable to have invited scrutiny into his domain. "I must thank you for coming so quickly, Mr. Holmes," he said, shaking our hands. "I confess I was not certain you would take an interest in what may prove to be nothing more than an old doctor's anxiety." "There is no such thing as nothing, Dr. Ferrars," Holmes replied pleasantly. "There are only things we have not yet examined with sufficient care. Perhaps you would be good enough to tell us about Lionel Marsh." Dr. Ferrars led us to his study, a room at the rear of the house overlooking a walled garden. He poured us each a small glass of sherry, a gesture, I thought, more for his own nerves than for our refreshment, and settled into his chair with the air of a man about to perform an unpleasant duty. Lionel Marsh, he told us, had been admitted to Houndsworth House in March of 1892, at the age of 38. He had been brought by his sister, Mrs. Beckford, and her husband, a solicitor named Gerald Beckfords, following what Dr. Ferrars described as a complete nervous collapse that had rendered Marsh unable to care for himself. The nature of this collapse was not entirely clear. Marsh had been a clerk in a shipping firm in the city, a bachelor of quiet habits and apparently steady temperament, and the crisis had come upon him suddenly, or so it had appeared to those around him. He had stopped attending his work. He had stopped eating. He had been found by his landlady sitting motionless in his room in complete darkness, unresponsive to speech or touch, and had remained in this state for several days before his sister was contacted. At Houndsworth, Marsh had been diagnosed with a severe melancholia compounded by what Dr. Ferrars termed a profound withdrawal from external reality. He did not speak for the first 4 months of his residence. He ate only when food was placed directly before him, and often not even then. He showed no interest in his surroundings, no recognition of visitors, no response to any of the therapeutic approaches that Dr. Ferrars and his small staff attempted. He was, in Dr. Ferrars' words, a man who had retreated so completely into himself that one wondered whether anyone remained inside at all. And then, gradually, he had begun to improve. Not dramatically. Marsh was never what anyone would call well. But slowly, over the course of his 2nd year, he began to speak again, first in single words, and then in short, quiet sentences. He began to take walks in the garden. He began to read, selecting books from the small library that Houndsworth maintained for its patients. He formed what Dr. Ferrars described as a gentle attachment to one of the attendants, a young woman named Ruth Calloway, who had shown particular patience and kindness in his care. He was not recovered. But he was, it seemed, returning. And then he died, Holmes said. Dr. Ferrars nodded, removing his spectacles and polishing them slowly. On the night of January the 7th, he was found in his room the following morning by Miss Calloway, who brought his breakfast. He was in his bed, the covers drawn up neatly. There was no sign of disturbance, no indication of struggle or distress. I examined him myself within the hour. His face was composed, even peaceful. I found no marks upon his body, no evidence of poison or violence. His heart had simply stopped. He was 41 years old and, so far as I was aware, in adequate physical health for a man of his habits. But such things do occur. I signed the certificate and arranged for the body to be released to his sister. And yet you wrote to me. Dr. Ferrars replaced his spectacles and regarded Holmes steadily. I wrote to you, Mr. Holmes, because of several things which, taken individually, amount to nothing, but which together have made it impossible for me to sleep soundly. The first is that Lionel Marsh had been improving. In my experience, patients who are emerging from profound melancholia do not simply die in the night without cause. The will to live was returning to him. I saw it in his eyes, heard it in his voice. The second is that on the evening before his death, Marsh said something to Miss Calloway which she reported to me only several days later, and which has troubled me since. He told her, "It is very quiet tonight. I think perhaps tonight I will be allowed to rest." She thought nothing of it at the time. A patient expressing a desire for rest is hardly remarkable. But in retrospect, the phrasing disturbs me. I will be allowed to rest. As though rest was something that had been withheld from him and was now being granted. Holmes was leaning forward slightly in his chair, his grey eyes sharp and attentive. You said there were several things? What else? The lock on Marsh's door, Dr. Ferrars said. Each patient's room at Houndsworth has a lock which can be operated from the outside by the staff, using a master key. The patients cannot lock themselves in. This is a precaution against self-harm. On the morning Marsh was found, his door was locked. This was not unusual. We lock the rooms each night as a matter of routine. But when I examined the lock afterward, I cannot tell you precisely why I did so, only that something compelled me. I found that the mechanism had been recently oiled. The other locks in that corridor had not. Someone had taken care to ensure that this particular lock would operate silently.
A silence settled over the study. Through the window, I could see the bare branches of an old oak moving slightly in the wind, and beyond them the gray line of a low wall. There is one more thing, Dr. Ferrars said quietly, and I tell you this not because I understand it, but because you should know it. Lionel Marsh kept a journal. He wrote in it almost daily during his final year with us. After his death, I looked for it in his room. It was gone. Holmes rose from his chair with the sudden energy that always marked the moment when a case had properly taken hold of him. I should like to see Marsh's room, if it has not been altered. I should like to speak with Miss Calloway, and I should like a list of every person, staff, patient, and visitor, who was present in this house on the night of January the 7th. Dr. Ferrars provided all of this with a cooperativeness that I found both admirable and, in its way, poignant. Here was a man who had built something he believed in, a place of care, of genuine compassion for those whose minds had failed them, and who now feared that something terrible had happened under his roof within the very system of trust and order that he had created. I have seen that particular expression before on the faces of parents who discover that their household has concealed a cruelty they never sanctioned. It is the look of a person realizing that good intentions are not, and have never been, sufficient protection against the darker workings of the human heart. Marsh's room was on the first floor, at the end of a quiet corridor. It was small but not uncomfortable. A narrow bed, a washstand, a writing desk by the window, a single bookshelf holding perhaps a dozen volumes. The window looked out into the walled garden, and I noticed that the glass was thick and fixed. It could not be opened. The room had been cleaned since Marsh's death, but not reassigned. His books remained on the shelf and a few personal items. A pocket watch, a framed photograph, a small carved figure of a dog, sat on the desk. Holmes examined the room with his customary thoroughness, which is to say that he examined everything. He spent several minutes on his hands and knees inspecting the floor near the door. He examined the lock from both sides, producing a small magnifying lens from his pocket. He opened and closed the door several times, listening to the sound it made. He studied the window frame, the bed frame, the washstand. He picked up the carved dog and turned it over in his fingers with an expression of quiet interest. "Watson," he said, "be good enough to smell this." He handed me a small glass bottle he had found in the washstand drawer, half hidden behind a folded cloth. I removed the stopper and detected a faint, sweet, slightly bitter scent that I recognized at once. "Chloral hydrate," I said. "In a bottle with no label, no prescription, and no reason to be in a patient's room. Dr. Ferrars, is chloral hydrate used in this institution?" Dr. Ferrars, who had accompanied us, looked genuinely startled. "It is kept in the dispensary, yes. We use it occasionally as a sedative for patients in acute distress. But it is controlled. It is not distributed to patients to self-administer. I have no idea how that bottle came to be in this room." "Nor I suspect did Lionel Marsh," Holmes said, placing the bottle carefully in his pocket. We spoke next with Ruth Calloway, the attendant who had discovered the body. She was a woman of perhaps 25, small and neat, with the kind of steady, watchful composure that I have observed in the best nurses. A calm that is not indifference but rather a disciplined tenderness, held carefully in check so that it might endure. She was clearly distressed by Marsh's death, and had been, I gathered, quietly grieving him in the weeks since. She answered Holmes's questions with care and precision, pausing often to ensure that she was remembering correctly rather than embellishing. She confirmed Dr. Ferrars's account of Marsh's final words to her, and added a detail that the superintendent had not mentioned. On the afternoon before his death, Marsh had received a visitor. This was not unusual in itself. Mrs. Beckford came every 2 or 3 weeks, and occasionally other visitors were admitted. But the visitor on that day had not been his sister. It had been a man, perhaps 45 or 50 years of age, well-dressed, with dark hair graying at the temples, and a manner that Miss Calloway described as very correct, very polished, but cold somehow, like a room that has been perfectly furnished, but where no one has ever lived. "Did you learn this man's name?" Holmes asked. "He signed the visitor's book as Mr. James Pell. He said he was an old friend of Mr. Marsh's from his days in the city. He was with Mr. Marsh for perhaps 40 minutes. When he left, Mr. Marsh was very quiet. Not upset exactly, but quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, as though he had been reminded of something he had been trying to forget." "And it was after this visit that he spoke to you about being allowed to rest?" "Yes, sir. It was that evening, perhaps an hour before I locked his door for the night." "You locked his door yourself?" "I did, sir. I always attended to Mr. Marsh's corridor. And you noticed nothing unusual about the lock? Miss Calloway hesitated. I did think it turned more easily than usual, but I thought nothing of it at the time. Holmes nodded slowly. One more question, Miss Calloway. The journal that Mr. Marsh kept. Did you ever see it? Can you describe it? A brown leather notebook, sir, rather worn. He wrote in it every afternoon, sitting at his desk by the window. He was very private about it. I never read any of it, nor would I have wished to. It was his, and he had so little that was his. I watched her as she said this, and I saw in her face something that moved me more than I can easily express. A grief that was entirely unselfish, entirely directed outward, toward a man who had almost certainly never understood the depth of her care for him. There are people in this world who give their compassion freely and without expectation of return, and they are, in my experience, the ones who suffer most when that compassion fails to protect. Holmes spent the remainder of the afternoon examining the visitor's book, the dispensary records, and the building itself. I accompanied him through corridors that were, I must say, maintained with a cleanliness and order that spoke well of Dr. Farrar's management. The patients we encountered were quiet, some of them reading or engaged in simple handicrafts, others sitting in a kind of vacant stillness that I found difficult to witness. One elderly man was speaking in a continuous, barely audible murmur to no one visible, his hands moving in small, repetitive patterns. A young woman stood at a window, her forehead pressed against the glass, watching the garden with an intensity that suggested she saw something there that no one else could see. These are the landscapes of the damaged mind, and they are not dramatic or terrifying, as popular fiction would have us believe. They are simply sad, in the way that all diminishment is sad, all loss of what a person might have been. The dispensary records showed that chloral hydrate had been withdrawn from stock on 3 occasions in the month before Marsh's death. 2 of these were documented with patient names and dosages, signed by Dr. Farrar's. The 3rd entry was irregular. The date was recorded, but the patient field was blank, and the signature was difficult to read, though it appeared to be that of a staff member named Horace Grindle, who served as the institution's general attendant and porter. "Tell me about Grindle," Holmes said to Dr. Farrar's as we stood in the dispensary, a small, well-organized room off the main corridor. Dr. Farrar's considered this with the measured care that characterized all his responses. "Grindle has been with me since I established Houndsworth nearly 8 years ago. He is a capable man, strong, reliable, and the patients do not trouble him, which is more than can be said for many who attempt this work. He is not educated, but he is steady. I have had no cause to complain of him. Has he any particular connection to the Marsh family, to Mrs. Beckford or her husband?" "None that I am aware of. I should like to speak with him." But Grindle, it transpired, was not on the premises. He had left that morning for what he described as a family matter in Reading, and was not expected back until the following day. Holmes received this information with a slight narrowing of the eyes that told me he found the timing noteworthy. That evening, we took rooms at a small inn in the village of Brimdene, a mile from Houndsworth. Over a simple dinner of cold beef and bread, Holmes laid out the threads of the case as he saw them, speaking in that precise, unhurried manner that he adopted when he was thinking aloud. "We have a man who was profoundly ill, who was slowly recovering, and who died suddenly on a night when his door lock had been freshly oiled, with a bottle of unlabeled chloral hydrate hidden in his washstand. We have a mysterious visitor on the afternoon of his death, a Mr. James Pell, supposedly an old friend, who left the deceased in a state of unusual quietness. We have a missing journal, and we have an irregular entry in the dispensary records, apparently made by a man who has now conveniently absented himself." "It seems clear enough to me," I said. "Marsh was poisoned with the chloral hydrate, administered by someone who entered his room during the night, having oiled the lock to ensure that the door could be opened without noise. The visitor, Pell, may have been involved. Perhaps he came to ensure that Marsh would not resist, or to deliver some communication that prepared him for what was to come." "Clear enough, Watson, and yet not clear at all. You have described a mechanism. What you have not described is a reason. Lionel Marsh was a clerk who had suffered a nervous collapse. He had been in an asylum for 3 years. He possessed, so far as we know, no fortune, no enemies, no secrets of any commercial or political value. Why would anyone wish him dead? And more importantly, why would anyone wish him dead precisely at the moment when he was beginning to recover? I had no answer to this, and Holmes did not expect one. He sat for a long time in silence, smoking his pipe, while the fire burned low and the sounds of the village outside, a dog barking, a cart on the road, gradually faded into the stillness of the night. The following morning, we called upon Mrs. Alice Beckford at her home in Godalming. She was a woman in her late 30s, thin and anxious, with the reddened eyes of someone who has been weeping intermittently for weeks. Her husband, Gerald Beckford, was at his offices, and she received us alone, in a small but well-kept sitting room that bore the marks of careful economy. Good furniture, but not much of it. Flowers in a plain vase, a carpet that had been turned to hide its wear. She spoke of her brother with a love that was fierce and weary in equal measure. She told us things that Dr. Ferrars had not known or had not thought to mention. Lionel Marsh, she said, had not always been a clerk. As a young man, he had been ambitious and talented, with a gift for mathematics and a position at a firm of actuaries that had promised a distinguished career. But something had happened. Mrs. Beckford did not know what precisely. When Lionel was 28 or 29, he had left the firm abruptly and taken the much lesser position as a shipping clerk. He had never explained why. He had become quieter, more withdrawn, more prone to long periods of solitude. She had watched him diminish over the years, the way one watches a lamp being slowly turned down, and she had been powerless to stop it. "Did he ever speak of a man named James Pell?" Holmes asked. Mrs. Beckford's expression changed. It was subtle, but I saw it. A tightening around the mouth, a flicker of something in the eyes that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. "Where did you hear that name?" "A man calling himself James Pell visited your brother at Houndsworth on the afternoon before his death. I take it the name is familiar to you." "Pell is not a name I know," she said carefully. "But if you are asking whether my brother had an association with someone from his earlier life, someone who might have wished to see him, yes, there was a man named Edmund Crail. He was a partner at the firm where Lionel worked, the actuarial firm, Harker and Crail. Lionel never spoke of him willingly, but I believe, Mr. Holmes, that whatever happened to my brother, whatever broke him, began with Edmund Crail." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "Can you describe Mr. Crail?" "I met him only once, years ago, at a dinner. He was perhaps 5 or 6 years older than Lionel. Dark hair, very composed, very self-possessed. A man who seemed to take great care in how he presented himself to the world." The description was close enough to Miss Calloway's account of the visitor to make the connection probable. Holmes pressed Mrs. Beckford for anything else she might know about Crail, about the firm, about her brother's departure from it, but she could offer little more. Lionel had refused to discuss it. He had shut that door with a completeness that she had found alarming even at the time, and she had respected his silence because she did not know what else to do. Before we left, Holmes asked whether Mrs. Beckford had ever seen her brother's journal. "He mentioned it to me once," she said, "during one of my visits. He said that he was writing things down because he had found that the act of writing made the thoughts quieter. He said," she paused, and I saw her compose herself with an effort that cost her something. "He said that there were things inside him that had been silent for too long, and that the silence had become louder than any noise." We returned to London that afternoon, and Holmes threw himself into research with the focused, almost ferocious energy that I knew so well. He sent telegrams. He consulted records at Somerset House. He dispatched a message to his network of unofficial informants. That remarkable web of street urchins, tradesmen, and minor functionaries who provided him with intelligence that no official agency could match. By the following evening, he had assembled a picture that was, I must confess, both clearer and more troubling than I had anticipated. The firm of Harker and Crail had been an actuarial practice of some reputation in the city during the late 1870s and 1880s. Its senior partner, Thomas Harker, had died in 1889, leaving the firm in the sole control of Edmund Crail. Lionel Marsh had been employed there from 1881 until his abrupt departure in 1884. The firm had subsequently changed its name and its character, becoming Crail and Associates, and had prospered considerably. Edmund Crail was now a wealthy man with a house in Mayfair and a reputation for philanthropic interests, including, Holmes discovered with a thin smile, a financial contribution to the establishment of Houndsworth House. "He funded the asylum?" I exclaimed. "A portion of the initial costs, yes. Dr. Ferrars secured funding from several sources. Crail's contribution was not the largest, but it was among the first. It would have given him knowledge of the institution, its practices, its layout, and, crucially, its staff." "You think Crail is behind Marsh's death?" "I think Edmund Crail visited Lionel Marsh under a false name on the afternoon before Marsh died. And I think the question we must answer is not whether he is involved, but what he was protecting. Something happened between these two men 12 years ago that destroyed Marsh and enriched Crail. Marsh spent 3 years in an asylum and died on the night he was visited by the man who ruined him. The journal, Watson, the journal is the key. In it, Marsh was finally writing down whatever he had kept silent about for over a decade. Someone took that journal because it contained a truth that could not be allowed to surface." Holmes was silent for a moment, and then he said something that has stayed with me. "Consider the cruelty of it. This was a man who had been silenced by fear, by shame, by whatever power Crail held over him. For 12 years, Marsh carried his secret alone, and it consumed him from within until there was almost nothing left. And then in the fragile dawn of his recovery, he began to speak, not aloud, but on paper. He began to reclaim his own story. And for that, he was killed." The word hung in the quiet of our rooms. Holmes reached for his pipe and filled it with the slow deliberation that marked his most reflective moods. "We must find that journal, Watson. And we must find Horace Grindle." Grindle proved easier to locate than we had expected. Holmes's inquiries revealed that the man had not gone to Reading at all, but was staying at a lodging house in Southwark, of the shabby but not disreputable kind favored by working men who wished to remain inconspicuous without descending into the criminal underclass. Holmes and I went to see him the following morning. He was a large, slow-moving man in his 40s, with heavy features and the wary, guarded manner of someone who knows he is in a position he does not fully understand. He was not hostile. Indeed, he seemed almost relieved to see us, in the way that a man burdened by a secret is sometimes relieved when the moment of confession arrives. Holmes had a particular talent for reading such men, for knowing precisely when to press and when to allow silence to do its work, and he employed this talent now with characteristic skill. The story that emerged was, in its essentials, simple. Grindle had been approached by a man he knew as Mr. Pell approximately 2 months before Marsh's death. Mr. Pell had come to Houndsworth ostensibly to inquire about the institution on behalf of a relative, and had engaged Grindle in conversation during his visit. Over subsequent weeks, through a series of meetings at a public house in Bramdean, Mr. Pell had cultivated a relationship with Grindle and had eventually made him an offer, £20, a very considerable sum for a man in Grindle's position, in exchange for 2 services. The first was to obtain a quantity of chloral hydrate from the dispensary and place it in Marsh's room. The second was to ensure that the lock on Marsh's door was oiled so that it could be opened without noise on a specific night. Grindle had not been told why. He insisted on this, and I believed him, because his bewilderment on the subject was too genuine, too deeply embedded in his manner, to be feigned. He had assumed, he said, that Mr. Pell intended to visit Marsh privately. For what purpose, he had not asked. He had not known that Marsh would die. When the death occurred, Grindle had been seized with panic, but Mr. Pell had contacted him one final time, had paid him the second half of the agreed sum, and had told him in terms that left no room for misunderstanding that if Grindle ever spoke of their arrangement, he would be charged as an accessory to murder and would hang. "He also asked me to bring him something," Grindle said, and the discomfort in his voice deepened. "A notebook, brown leather, from the dead man's desk. I was to take it before anyone noticed it was missing and bring it to him at the public house, which I did." "And what did Mr. Pell do with it?" "Put it inside his coat. That was the last I saw of it, or of him." Holmes regarded Grindle for a long moment, then asked a question that surprised me. Mr. Grindle, on the night of January the 7th, was Mr. Marsh's door unlocked at any point during the night? Grindle shook his head. No, sir. That's what I've been turning over in my mind. I oiled the lock like he asked. I put the bottle in the washstand, but nobody came so far as I know. I sleep in a room at the end of the corridor, and I'm a light sleeper. I heard no footsteps, no door opening. Nobody entered that room during the night. Then how, I said, did Marsh die? Holmes did not answer immediately. He thanked Grindle, extracted a promise that the man would remain at his lodgings and speak to no one, and we departed. In the cab on the way back to Baker Street, Holmes was silent, but it was a different silence from his usual contemplative moods. There was something in it that I can only describe as sadness, though I would not have used that word to his face. It was not until the following day that Holmes presented his completed theory, and he did so not in our rooms but at Houndsworth House, in Dr. Farrar's study, with the superintendent and Miss Calloway both present. He had asked me to send a telegram to Mrs. Beckford inviting her to join us, and she arrived looking pale and anxious, clutching the arm of her husband, a solid, unremarkable man who seemed uncertain of what role he was expected to play. Holmes stood by the window, the gray light of another overcast day behind him, and spoke with a quietness that I had not often heard from him. The quietness of a man who takes no pleasure in being right. Mrs. Beckford, he began, I must ask you a question that will cause you pain, and I apologize for it. In his early career, your brother worked closely with Edmund Crail. During that time, did your brother ever give any indication that he had discovered something about Crail's practices? Something dishonest? Something that Crail would not have wished to be known? Mrs. Beckford's hand tightened on her husband's arm. Lionel once told me, this was years ago, before his collapse, that he had learned something at the firm that he wished he had never learned. I pressed him, but he would not say more. He said that knowing it had made him complicit, and that he could not forgive himself for his silence. Holmes nodded. I have spent the past 2 days investigating the financial records of Harker and Crail during the period of your brother's employment. The firm handled actuarial calculations for several insurance companies. Between 1882 and 1884, a pattern of irregularities occurred in the mortality tables prepared for one particular client, the Consolidated Mutual Assurance Company. These irregularities had the effect of significantly undervaluing the risk associated with certain classes of policy, which in turn allowed Consolidated Mutual to offer lower premiums and attract more business. Edmund Crail was the actuary responsible for these calculations. The errors were not errors. They were deliberate manipulations, and they were immensely profitable. Not for the policyholders, who were inadequately protected, but for Consolidated Mutual and, through a private arrangement, for Edmund Crail himself. He paused. The room was very still. Your brother discovered this fraud. He was a gifted mathematician. The falsifications would have been apparent to him. But he was young, and Crail was his superior, and the revelation would have destroyed not only Crail but the firm and everyone associated with it. I believe Crail confronted your brother, either before or after your brother attempted to raise the matter, and that Crail found a way to ensure his silence. Whether through threats to your brother's career, through some personal leverage, or simply through the overwhelming pressure that a powerful man can exert upon a subordinate, Crail silenced him. And your brother bore that silence for 12 years. He bore the knowledge that people had been harmed, that families had paid premiums to an insurer that could not adequately cover their claims. And he bore the guilt of his own complicity, his failure to speak. That guilt consumed him. It was the engine of his collapse, the foundation of his melancholia, and the reason he withdrew so completely from the world. He could not live with what he knew and what he had failed to do. Mrs. Beckford was weeping silently. Her husband stood rigid beside her, his jaw clenched. At Houndsworth, Holmes continued, Marsh slowly began to recover, and as he recovered, he began to write. The journal was his confession, his account of what Crail had done and of his own role in concealing it. This was the act that sealed his fate. I do not know how Crail became aware of the journal's existence. Perhaps through his connection to the institution's finances, perhaps through some other channel. But he learned of it, and he understood immediately that the journal represented an existential threat. The fraud was old but not beyond prosecution, and the reputational damage alone would have destroyed everything Crail had built in the years since. "So he came to Houndsworth and killed my brother," Mrs. Beckford said, her voice raw. "No," Holmes said. "That is what I believed at first, and it is what the evidence was designed to suggest. But it is not what happened. Edmund Crail visited your brother on the afternoon of January the 7th under the name James Pell. He came, I believe, to make one final attempt to secure your brother's silence, to persuade him, to threaten him, to offer him whatever inducement might prevent the journal from ever being read by other eyes. He came for the same reason he had arranged for the chloral hydrate to be placed in your brother's room, as a contingency, a means of rendering Marsh insensible so that the journal could be taken without difficulty. The oiled lock was to allow Crail or an agent to enter the room during the night, administer a stronger dose, take the journal, and leave. But the plan as such was never executed. No one entered Marsh's room that night. Grindle, whom Crail had bribed, confirms this, and I believe him." "Then what happened?" Dr. Ferrars asked, leaning forward. Holmes turned to face the window, and when he spoke again, his voice was very quiet. "Lionel Marsh took the chloral hydrate himself. He found the bottle in his washstand, placed there by Grindle as Crail had arranged, and he understood immediately what it meant. He understood that Crail had found him, that Crail had penetrated even this last refuge, and that the recovery he had fought so hard for was, in the end, no protection at all. He knew what the bottle was for. He knew that Crail's visit that afternoon was a warning, a final overture before more decisive action, and he made a choice. The silence in the room was absolute. He chose to end it on his own terms. He drank the chloral hydrate, not enough to render him merely unconscious, but enough, in his weakened state, to stop his heart. He did so calmly, deliberately. He arranged himself in his bed. He drew the covers up, and he died. Not because Edmund Crail killed him, but because Edmund Crail had made it impossible for him to live. The silence that had been imposed upon him for 12 years, the silence that had broken him, reached into the one place where he had begun to find peace and reminded him that there was no escape from it. He chose death over a return to that silence. Holmes turned back to face the room. The journal was taken afterward by Grindle, who did not know what it contained, and delivered to Crail. Crail believed his secret was safe. He did not know that Mrs. Beckford would contact me, or that Dr. Ferrars' conscience would not permit him to let the matter rest. I watched the faces in the room. Dr. Ferrars had removed his spectacles and was holding them in both hands, staring at nothing. Miss Calloway stood very still, her lips pressed together, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Mrs. Beckford had stopped weeping and sat with a terrible, rigid composure that I recognized as the stillness of someone absorbing a blow so profound that the body does not yet know how to respond. Gerald Beckford was the first to speak. "Can Crail be prosecuted?" "For the fraud, yes, if sufficient evidence can be gathered, and I believe it can. I have already communicated certain information to a contact at Scotland Yard. For Marsh's death," Holmes hesitated, and it was one of the very few times I have seen him struggle with his own conclusion. "The law will call it suicide. Crail did not administer the dose. He did not enter the room. He did not, in any legally demonstrable sense, kill Lionel Marsh. That he created the conditions which made Marsh's death inevitable. That he placed the instrument of death within reach and ensured, through years of oppression and a final, calculated act of intimidation, that Marsh would use it. These are moral facts, not legal ones. I am sorry. There is little more to tell. The machinery of justice moves slowly, as it always does, but it moved. Edmund Crail was arrested some weeks later on charges of fraud relating to his manipulation of the consolidated mutual mortality tables. The case attracted considerable attention in the financial press, and Crail's carefully constructed reputation was dismantled with the thoroughness that public opinion reserves for those who have pretended to virtue while practicing corruption. He was convicted and sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. It was not enough. It could never be enough. The law punished him for the fraud, not for the destruction of a human life, because the law does not recognize the kind of killing that Crail had committed. The slow, patient murder of a man's will to live. The journal was never recovered. Crail denied its existence, and no search of his property produced it. I believe he burned it, and with it the only account Lionel Marsh ever wrote of his own suffering, in his own words. This loss troubled me more than the inadequacy of the legal outcome, and I think it troubled Holmes as well, though he said little about it. To spend a year setting down the truth of your life, to build word by careful word the testament that your voice could never deliver, and to have it destroyed by the very person whose crimes you were finally daring to name. There is something in this that goes beyond injustice into a realm of cruelty that I find difficult to contemplate without anger. Miss Calloway left Houndsworth House within the month. I learned from Dr. Ferrars in a letter he sent some time later that she had taken a position at a hospital in Bristol and was doing well. He wrote of her with a warmth and respect that suggested he understood, as I did, that she had given Lionel Marsh something genuine and irreplaceable in his final year. The simple, steady presence of someone who saw him not as a patient or a problem, but as a person. Whether Marsh understood this, we cannot know. I hope that he did. I hope that in the small carved figure of a dog that sat on his desk, a figure which, Holmes later told me, bore the marks of having been handled constantly, turned over and over in the hands of a man with nothing else to hold. There was some evidence of an attachment to the tangible world, some thread of connection that made his suffering, if not bearable, then at least not entirely solitary. Holmes and I did not discuss the case at length afterward. It was not the sort of case that invited discussion. There was no elegance in the solution, no satisfaction in the unraveling. We had found the truth, as we always did, and the truth was that a man had been broken by another man's greed and cowardice, and that the breaking had taken 12 years, and that at the end of it, the broken man had been left with nothing, not even the choice of how to tell his own story. I remember one evening, perhaps a week after the matter was concluded, sitting with Holmes by the fire at Baker Street. He had been reading, and he set his book down and stared into the flames for a long time. Then he said without looking at me, "There are crimes, Watson, for which the law provides no remedy, because the law concerns itself with actions and not with the spaces between them. Crail did not kill Marsh. He merely removed, one by one, every reason Marsh had to live, and then waited. The silence did the rest." I did not reply. There was nothing adequate to say. Outside, the city went about its business, and the night settled over Baker Street with its customary indifference. And I thought of Lionel Marsh sitting at his desk by the window at Houndsworth, writing in his brown leather journal, setting down at last the words that had been trapped inside him for so long, believing perhaps that the act of writing them would finally set him free. And I thought of how in the end it was not the silence that killed him, but the hope of breaking it, the fragile, agonizing hope that the truth might still matter, arriving at last in the same moment as the certainty that it never would. Some cases Holmes solved, and I recorded with pride. This one I have recorded only because it deserves to be remembered, not as a triumph of deduction, but as a testament to the damage that silence can do when it is enforced by power and sustained by shame. Lionel Marsh deserved better than the life he was given, and better than the death he chose. And if these pages serve any purpose at all, let it be this, that his name at least is not silent any longer.